Clarice always told herself that working the night shift was a practical choice, but deep down, she knew it was more of an escape. The solitude of the pharmacy, lit by a flickering fluorescent sign, seemed to mirror her own state of mind. There, away from the crowds, she found a strange kind of comfort, even if it was wrapped in a constant feeling of unease. The 24-hour pharmacy was in a quiet neighborhood during the day, but at night, it transformed. Silence dominated, broken only by the occasional sound of a car passing on the avenue or hurried footsteps from someone too preoccupied to glance her way. Inside, the cold, artificial light was a sharp contrast to the darkness outside, where shadows shifted uneasily whenever the wind rustled the trees. Clarice liked to organize the shelves to keep herself busy. The neatly arranged rows of medication felt like a sanctuary of order in a chaotic world. But tonight, something felt different. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the feeling was as real as the floor beneath her feet. She found herself glancing at the glass door more often than usual, as if expecting something or someone. While checking the expiration dates on common pain relievers, she heard the bell above the door chime. The first customer of the night. It was a man, maybe in his 40s, with a nondescript appearance at first glance. He wore a dark jacket and a cap that obscured much of his face. He walked slowly to the counter and handed her a prescription. "Good evening. How can I help you?" Clarice asked, trying to sound friendly, though a slight chill ran down her spine when she met his eyes. Too dark, too steady to feel natural. He didn't reply, simply sliding the prescription toward her with long, thin fingers. Clarice took the paper and read it. It was for a medication she had never heard of, Etrovanil X. "One moment, please." She typed the name into the system, but no results came up. The name didn't exist. "It looks like this medication isn't listed. Are you sure the prescription is correct?" she asked, looking up, only to see the man already walking out. Saying nothing, the door closed with a soft click, leaving Clarice holding the prescription, staring at the empty space he left behind. A sense of wrongness began to settle in her chest, but she tried to shake it off. It was just another night, she told herself. Just another night. Even after the man left, she couldn't get the prescription out of her head. She examined the paper again. The name Etrovanil X was written in peculiar, shaky handwriting, as if the person who wrote it was either nervous or in a hurry. There was no doctor's stamp, no additional information, just that name, which for some reason seemed to echo in her mind. She slid the paper under the counter, determined not to think about it anymore, but the stillness of the night refused to give her peace. The ticking of the wall clock seemed louder than usual, and the hum of the fluorescent lights created an irritating backdrop. Hours passed as Clarice tried to get back into her routine. She organized medications, wiped down the counter, and checked the vitamin shelves. But just as she began to relax, the bell above the door rang again. This time, it was a woman. She wore a shabby beige dress and noisy sandals, clutching a worn-out bag that seemed heavier than it should be. Her face was partially covered by a scarf, but her sunken eyes, with dark circles that looked like hollow shadows, were unmistakable. "Good evening. Can I help you?" Clarice asked, trying to sound natural, though the same chill from earlier crept up her spine, this time stronger. The woman opened her bag, pulled out a piece of paper, and placed it on the counter. It was another prescription, even stranger than the last. Clarice picked it up, and her heart raced. Metropilax C, for emergency use only. The instructions were even more perplexing. The prescribed dosage was absurd. 15 pills within 30 minutes. And the paper itself gave off a metallic scent like rusted iron. "Ma'am, this medication? I've never heard of it. Are you sure?" "You have it," the woman interrupted, her voice raspy and low, barely above a whisper. "I need it. Now." Clarice's stomach churned. She checked the system again, but as expected, nothing came up. "I'm sorry, but we don't have this medication. Is there something else I can help you with?" The woman tilted her head at an odd angle, as if studying Clarice. For a few seconds, time seemed to freeze, and the room grew so quiet that Clarice could hear her own breathing. Then, without another word, the woman snatched the paperback and left in a hurry, leaving behind a metallic scent that lingered in the air for minutes. Clarice felt a heavy weight settle in her chest. Something was wrong, very wrong. But despite her fear, she needed answers. She decided to search for the names of the medications online. Maybe it was just a coincidence. After several frustrating attempts, she stumbled across a result on an obscure site, buried deep in the threads of an old forum. The page listed medications with similar names, all described as drugs for souls in transition. A shiver ran down her spine. Souls in transition? What kind of customer would ask for medications like that? Clarice wasn't sure she should keep reading or erase the page from her browser history. Something deep inside told her it was no longer safe to ignore what was happening. The sense of unease clung to her, even as she tried to focus on her routine. Every time she glanced at the pharmacy entrance, it felt as though something was watching her back. The hours dragged on, and then the bell above the door chimed again, echoing through the empty space. This time, the customer was even more peculiar. A tall, unnaturally thin man, dressed in outdated clothing that seemed to belong to another era. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that obscured much of his face. As he approached the counter, Clarice noticed something unsettling. He didn't seem to be breathing. "Good evening," she said, trying to keep her composure, though her voice quivered slightly. The man placed a paper bag on the counter. She couldn't take her eyes off his hands. They were unnaturally long and thin, with joints that moved in ways they shouldn't. "This is for you," he said, his voice low and resonant, as he slid the bag toward her. Clarice hesitated before picking it up. Inside was what looked like a small book, bound in black leather, with inscriptions she didn't recognize. Alongside it was another prescription. The paper was stained, as though it had been wet and dried hastily. She unfolded the prescription and read aloud in a whisper. "Amphadon are administered with caution." Before she could ask anything, the man stepped back and spoke again. "Read the book. You'll understand." And, like the others, he left without waiting for a reply. Clarice called out to him, but the door had already closed. When she looked outside, there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Back at the counter, she opened the small book with trembling hands. Its pages were filled with drawings and words in a language she couldn't decipher. But some images were disturbingly clear. Bodies dissolving into shadows, disfigured faces, and symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under the harsh pharmacy light. Toward the back of the book, she found what appeared to be a set of rules. She could only make out the first one. Never dispense a medication you cannot identify. If you do, you will bear the consequence. The bell above the door rang again, jolting her out of her thoughts. This time, it wasn't just one person. Two figures entered together, their steps perfectly synchronized, almost as if they were mirror images of each other. They wore simple black clothing, but what caught Clarice's attention were their eyes. They had no pupils. "We're here for the request." Their voices echoed in unison, deep, resonant, and unsettling. Clarice took a step back. "Excuse me, but what request?" They didn't answer. Instead, both pointed to the book in her hands. The tension in the air became suffocating, as if the pharmacy itself had come alive, watching every move. Clarice felt her throat go dry, and the faint hum of the overhead lights now roared in her ears like a deafening buzz. "You need to leave," she managed to say, her voice trembling. The two figures didn't move. One of them reached into their pocket and placed something on the counter. A gold coin, ancient and corroded. Clarice stared at the object hesitant. When she finally touched it, a bone-deep chill shot through her, as though she plunged into icy water. The payment has been made. Hand over what we've asked for. The voices intoned again, reverberating like a command. Clarice opened her mouth to protest, but before she could say anything, the figures turned and walked out. The silence they left behind was heavy, the faint scent of sulfur lingering in the air. She looked down at the counter. The coin was still there, its strange golden sheen faintly glowing. The book in her hands felt heavier, almost alive. Deep down, she knew the night was far from over. The oppressive silence of the pharmacy seemed to thicken after they left. Clarice kept her eyes fixed on the coin, unsure of what to do. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, with that object. The eerie glow and the chill from touching it lingered on her skin, as if it had left an invisible mark. Trying to distract herself, she tucked the coin into the pocket of her lab coat, shut the book, and placed it back in the paper bag. Maybe if she ignored everything, the night would go on as usual, but she knew she was lying to herself. Around 3 in the morning, the pharmacy door opened again, but this time the bell didn't ring. A man stepped inside, his movements eerily silent. He was short, dressed in a faded black suit, and moved with slow, deliberate steps, almost as if he were gliding. When he reached the counter, Clarice noticed something deeply unsettling. His face was blank. Literally, his skin was smooth, devoid of any features. No mouth, no nose, no eyebrows. Only 2 small, sunken eyes stared back at her from deep within their sockets. "Are you here to pick something up?" Clarice asked, trying to maintain composure, though her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he slid another piece of paper onto the counter. Clarice hesitated before picking it up, but curiosity overpowered her fear. The prescription read, Solvanium Z, for use in unstable souls. The words unstable souls made her stomach turn. It was the 3rd time that night someone had requested an unusual medication, and the mounting coincidences were pulling her into a place she desperately didn't want to go. "This medication, it doesn't exist," she said, her voice shaky. The figure remained still. His small, dark eyes seemed to pierce through her, forcing her to look away. Suddenly, an odd sound echoed through the pharmacy, a blend of whispering and cracking, coming from somewhere deep within the aisles. Instinctively, Clarice glanced back, but she saw nothing. When she turned to the counter again, the man was gone. The prescription was still there. This time, Clarice couldn't brush it off. She picked up the paper and compared it to the others from earlier that night. The handwriting was different, but the pattern was the same. Nonsensical drug names and instructions that felt more ritualistic than medical. She opened the mysterious book she'd been given, flipping through the stained, symbol-laden pages, searching for answers. Eventually, she found a section that seemed to match the drugs mentioned. Solvanium Z stabilizes souls in transition. Amplodon R blocks entities from higher planes. Metropolax C prevents dimensional ruptures. The list went on, but Clarice couldn't bring herself to read further. Each entry felt more ominous than the last. A sharp, metallic sound made her jump. She turned to see the gold coin she'd tucked into her pocket was now back on the counter, as if it had never been moved. But this time, it bore an engraving, a symbol resembling an eye with a vertical slit at its center. The air around her grew heavier, pressing down like an invisible weight. A low, resonant hum began vibrating through the pharmacy, and the fluorescent lights flickered violently, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Clarice ran to the door, desperately trying to open it, but the lock wouldn't budge. It was as though the pharmacy had sealed itself shut from the inside. The hum was now accompanied by a faint, distant laugh that sent chills down her spine. For the first time, she felt truly alone, or perhaps not alone at all. She looked back at the counter, where the coin gleamed ominously. The book emanated a sickly sweet odor, and the prescriptions seemed to pulse, as though alive. Clarice knew they were all connected. The book, the coin, and the strange visitors. But how? The only thing she was sure of was that she needed to get out of the pharmacy. Yet something, or someone, seemed intent on keeping her there. Her breathing quickened as she forced herself to step back toward the counter. Each movement felt more labored, as if the air itself resisted her. The coin's glow grew stronger. The book symbols seemed to shift under the flickering lights, and the prescriptions vibrated faintly, as if they were alive and waiting. Sitting down, Clarice opened the pharmacy's laptop, determined to uncover more about the strange medications and the events unfolding around her. She typed the names again: Solvanium Z, Metropolax C, Amplodon R. This time, she ventured into obscure forums and less reputable websites, ignoring the gnawing fear that perhaps some things were better left unknown. After countless failed attempts, she stumbled across an ancient thread on a forum called Obscura Medicina. The thread's title sent a chill down her spine. The Conductor's Remedies, Treatments for Lost Souls. The post was an unsettling mix of warning and delirium. The Conductors walk among us, carrying prescriptions that should never exist. The medications they seek are meant to correct imbalances between realms. Never deny them, but also never provide them. Every interaction comes at a cost. And remember, if you receive a coin, the payment has already been accepted. Clarice's stomach churned. Her eyes darted to the coin on the counter. As if in response, the coin began to spin slowly on its own, untouched by any visible force. The thread went on, offering chilling insights. The listed medications were described as treatments for supernatural disturbances. One comment stood out: if someone hands you the book, you've been chosen. The pharmacy is no longer yours. You now belong to it. This is insane, Clarice whispered, her voice barely audible as the weight of dread bore down on her. She began to notice something she hadn't before. The pharmacy's shelves seemed different. Medications she didn't recognize now lined the aisles, bottles and boxes with names that sounded oddly familiar yet impossible. Dormivan X, Reflexil M, Transitus. These weren't in the inventory system, but had replaced the common over-the-counter drugs she stocked every night. Clarice picked up one of the unfamiliar bottles. It was cold to the touch, unnaturally so, as if it had just been pulled from deep storage. The label read, "For use during energy rupture events. Single dose. Consult your conductor." The coin in her pocket grew heavier again, pressing against her as if alive. This wasn't paranoia. Something was toying with her. The doorbell rang, but this time the sound felt deeper, resonating through her chest. The atmosphere shifted, and the entrance itself seemed darker, as though the surrounding air had thickened with malice. The figure that entered was unlike anything Clarice had ever seen. It wasn't human. There was no face, no arms, no legs. Instead, a humanoid shadow hovered in the doorway, absorbing the light around it, casting no reflection or shadow of its own. The shadow drifted silently to the counter, placing a new prescription in front of her. Its presence was suffocating oppressive. With trembling hands, Clarice picked up the slip of paper and read the words written in jagged, inhuman script. Lumen Profundus. To access the portal, her heart nearly stopped. The name of the medication matched one of the final pages of the book. She frantically flipped it open and found the description: for opening pathways between worlds. Use with extreme caution. May destroy the barrier between the known and the forgotten. She looked at the shadow, which remained motionless. "I can't help you," she said, her voice trembling. Suddenly, the shadow began to expand, filling the entire pharmacy. Lights burst. The laptop shut off on its own, and Clarice felt the ground vibrating beneath her feet. She tried to run to the door, but was met with something even worse. Her reflection in the glass wasn't hers. It was someone or something else. Clarice instinctively stepped back upon seeing the reflection. It was like staring at a distorted version of herself. A face that resembled hers but was twisted. The eyes were black, like bottomless pits, and the mouth stretched into a wide, sinister grin that seemed to grow larger with each passing second. She shut her eyes, taking deep breaths to steady herself. When she opened them again, the reflection was gone, but the unease lingered, heavy in her chest like an oppressive weight. The pharmacy was bathed in an eerie gloom. The lights flickered erratically, and the electric hum seemed to whisper words she couldn't quite make out. She wanted to convince herself it was all in her head, but reality was warping more with every passing moment. Then the bell above the door rang again. Clarice turned slowly, her muscles stiff with fear, dreading what she might see. A man walked in, dressed in seemingly ordinary clothes, jeans and a t-shirt. But something was terribly off. He didn't walk. He glided, his feet never touching the ground. His skin was pale, waxy, and his eyes were entirely white, void of pupils. In his hands, he held a small box wrapped in what looked like old, weathered leather. "Are you ready to accept the final payment?" he asked, his voice resonating like an echo that filled the space despite being no louder than a whisper. "Payment?" Clarice managed to mumble, her voice faltering. I don't know what you mean." The man smiled, but his lips didn't move. The smile appeared directly in her mind, accompanied by an icy chill that shot through her body. He placed the box on the counter and glided backward, remaining silent. Clarice stared at the object. She didn't want to open it, but it felt as if something within her was being compelled to do so. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid, revealing something that made her heart stop. Inside the box was a glass vial containing a red liquid that seemed to pulse, like living blood. On the label, written in golden letters, were the words, "Essentia Vitali, forbidden for humans." The message felt personal, as though it was meant specifically for her. The final line whispered directly into her mind, both a warning and a threat. She slammed the box shut and stepped back. I won't accept this," she said, her voice breaking with desperation. The man tilted his head, and his white eyes began to weep a dark, oil-like liquid. "You already have, Clarice. From the moment you took the book." Before she could respond, the man vanished like a shadow swallowed by the light, leaving the box on the counter. The pharmacy was empty again, but the oppressive sensation of being watched weighed heavily on her. She turned to look at the coin, now glowing intensely, and the book, which seemed to pulse like a beating heart. The prescriptions were neatly stacked beside the box, as if arranged by invisible hands. Then she noticed something horrifying. The medications mentioned in the prescriptions were now on the shelves behind her. Clarice was certain they hadn't been there before. It was as though the pharmacy was creating the products on its own, fulfilling the demands of clients who shouldn't exist. She backed up against the counter, her gaze fixed on the shelves. Every vial seemed to call to her, each label whispering secrets she didn't want to hear. She knew she had to get out, but the most terrifying question loomed in her mind. What if escape wasn't possible? Clarice felt her sanity teetering on the edge. Something had changed within the pharmacy, something that defied logic and transcended everything she understood about reality. The book, the coin, the prescriptions, every element seemed like a piece of a macabre puzzle she couldn't quite piece together. Determined to find answers, Clarice picked up the book again. Her trembling hands flipped through the pages as she tried to ignore the grotesque illustrations and symbols that seemed to shift under the flickering light. Then she found a section titled, "The Pharmacy of Thresholds." The text explained that certain places acted as connection points between the world of the living and other planes of existence. These locations, often overlooked by humans, were used by conductors to travel between realities. The pharmacy where Clarice worked was described with unsettling precision. If you find the golden coin, you have been chosen to serve at the threshold. You are no longer a pharmacist. You are a guardian. Clarice's heart raced. A guardian of what? She hadn't asked for this. She didn't want to be part of something so strange and dangerous. She turned the page, and the next passage felt like it was speaking directly to her. Conductors demand order. They follow the rules of the threshold. But beware, if you break a rule, the consequences will be irreversible. The rules were listed below. Never refuse a prescription. Never dispense medications you don't recognize without consulting the book. Never leave the pharmacy during the night shift. Clarice felt the ground drop out from under her when she read the last rule. She had already tried to open the door. Had that triggered something? Before she could dwell on her thoughts, the doorbell rang again. But this time, the sound was different, drawn out, almost like a scream. Clarice turned to the entrance, and her breath caught in her throat. 3 figures entered together. They didn't walk, but glided across the floor like liquid shadows. Each one had a grotesque appearance. One with elongated arms that dragged along the ground, another with a disproportionately large head covered in countless eyes, and the last, shrouded in a dense smoke that obscured its form entirely. They approached the counter, and the first figure placed a prescription on it. Clarice hesitated, but she knew she couldn't break another rule. She picked up the paper and read, "Essentia Mortem, single dose, for the final rift." "What does this mean?" she asked, but none of the figures responded. Then something strange happened. The book began to open on its own, the pages flipping violently until it stopped at a section Clarice hadn't read before. The title was clear, "The Final Ritual." The text made her head spin. The medication listed in the prescription was used to seal passages between worlds. However, the process required a sacrifice, not an object or an animal, but something far more personal. Clarice slammed the book shut. "I won't do this. I won't be part of this," she shouted, her voice trembling with defiance. The figures began to move, slowly encircling her. The smoke surrounding one of them started to spread, making the air heavier and harder to breathe. Clarice had nowhere to run, but her mind raced frantically. There had to be something in the book, in the rules, maybe a way to undo all of this. She knew she needed to act fast, or she'd be consumed by the pharmacy, the figures, or something far worse. As she struggled to control her rising panic, she noticed the coin in her pocket growing hotter, almost burning her skin. It was as if it was calling for her attention. "Can I continue to the next chapter?" The coin burned like a live ember in Clarice's pocket. She quickly pulled it out, but the moment she held it in her hand, the sensation of heat vanished instantly. The coin now felt heavier, as though it carried something beyond its simple, unassuming appearance. The 3 figures continued to close in, their movements slow and deliberate, as the buzzing in the pharmacy grew louder and louder, reaching a nearly deafening pitch. The lights flickered frantically, casting warped shadows on the walls that seemed to twist and writhe with a life of their own. Clarice clenched the coin tightly and looked toward the book on the counter. She knew the answers lay within, but every word in that cursed volume felt like a death sentence. Even so, with no other choice, she opened it again. The pages turned on their own, stopping once more at the section detailing the final ritual. In the center of the page, written in bold letters with gold accents, were the words, "To break the cycle, the guardian must be offered. Choose between life and the threshold." "Guardian, is that me?" Clarice whispered to herself. The figure seemed to hear her. The one with elongated arms extended one grotesque limb, pointing directly at the coin in her hand. Its voice was like a distant scream mixed with the sound of shattering glass. "The coin has chosen." Clarice took a step back, but her body felt frozen. It was as if the very floor beneath her was holding her in place, locking her down as the figures crept closer. "What do you want?" she shouted, desperation flooding her every word. The figure with the head full of eyes leaned in closer, its countless orbs moving in all directions, studying her intently. Its voice resonated directly in her mind, silent yet piercing. "Balance. You accept or you consume." Clarice didn't fully understand the meaning of those words, but the overwhelming sense that time was slipping away was impossible to ignore. She looked at the coin, the book, and the figures in front of her. Everything seemed to conspire to push her toward a choice she didn't want to make. Then, something shifted. The pharmacy's shelves began to shake violently, bottles and boxes tumbling to the floor, scattering medications everywhere. Amid the chaos, the back door, leading to the storeroom, creaked open slowly. Clarice had never feared that space before, but now it felt like a portal to something unknown. Beyond the door, a faint, pulsating light illuminated the hallway, accompanied by the eerie sound of footsteps echoing through the emptiness. Though no one was visible, the figures withdrew from the counter and turned their gaze toward the open door. For the first time, they seemed hesitant, almost fearful. Clarice realized this was her chance. Clutching the coin and the book tightly, she bolted toward the hallway. But as soon as she crossed the threshold, the familiar corridor vanished. She now stood in a vast, otherworldly chamber. The walls were made of ancient stone, etched with glowing, indecipherable inscriptions. The air was cold and heavy, like the atmosphere deep underwater. In the center of the space, an immense, shifting figure floated, its form constantly changing, as if made of smoke and light. A voice emanated from the figure, deep and resonant, filling every corner of the chamber. "Guardian, you have crossed the threshold. Now, you must decide." "Decide what?" Clarice shouted, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't choose this. You accepted the coin. The coin accepts you. The balance has been broken, and it is your duty to restore it. Sacrifice yourself or sacrifice the threshold." Clarice stared at the coin in her hand, feeling the weight of her decision. If she chose the threshold, she knew something terrible would happen, not just to her, but to everything she knew. Yet, self-sacrifice seemed an even darker fate. The book had hinted that the Guardian would never find peace. "This isn't fair," she whispered, her voice trembling. The towering figure remained silent, its overwhelming presence seeming to judge her every thought. Clarice fell to her knees, her mind a whirlwind of despair and disbelief. The figure's words echoed endlessly. "Sacrifice yourself or sacrifice the threshold." The coin in her hand pulsed rhythmically, almost alive, demanding a decision. "I didn't ask for this," she screamed, her voice reverberating through the vast chamber. "Why me?" The figure responded with a calmness that felt more cruel than any threat. "The threshold chooses those who already carry the burden of imbalance. You were called because you were already broken." Clarice felt a lump form in her throat. It was true that her life was far from perfect. The isolation, the mistakes of her past, the endless nights trying to escape herself during her pharmacy shifts. But did that mean she deserved this? She looked at the coin again. The symbol engraved on it now glowed brightly, casting strange, twisting shadows along the stone walls. The book in her other hand felt heavier, as though it demanded to be opened. "Is there another option?" she asked, a faint thread of hope clinging to her voice. The figure hesitated for a moment, its shifting form dimming slightly. "There is always a choice, but every choice has a price. You can restore balance to the threshold without sacrificing yourself directly. However, it will require an exchange." "What kind of exchange?" The figure extended an appendage of both light and shadow toward Clarice. With a slow, deliberate gesture, it revealed a portal that began to open before her. Through the portal, she saw the pharmacy, but not as she remembered it. It was crumbling, its shelves overtaken by pulsating black vegetation. Grotesque, distorted customers wandered aimlessly through the aisles, their hollow eyes fixed on nothing. You may become one with the threshold, an eternal presence controlling the balance between worlds. But in doing so, you will no longer be Clarice. You will no longer be human. A sharp wave of terror struck her, becoming a permanent guardian, losing her identity, her feelings, her very humanity. That was the price of this so-called third option. She turned her gaze back to the portal. The hum in her ears grew louder, and she felt an invisible force pulling her toward a decision. Time was slipping away, and the figure's words echoed relentlessly in her mind. "Sacrifice yourself. Sacrifice the threshold. Or sacrifice your humanity." Clarice took a deep breath, tears streaming down her face, as she clenched the coin so tightly that her hand began to bleed. "If this is what must be done," she whispered. She made her decision. Clarice gripped the coin and the book tightly, as if they were the last anchors tethering her to reality. The immense figure before her seemed to pulse with anticipation, while the portal to the decaying pharmacy remained open, radiating an oppressive light. "What will it be, Guardian?" The figure intoned, its voice reverberating through every fiber of her being. Clarice closed her eyes, the weight of her choice pressing down like an unbearable storm. Then, with trembling resolve, she stepped forward. She knew her choice was final. There was no turning back. "I choose," she murmured, her voice faltering as she closed her eyes. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then, the figure spoke, its voice now thundering. "So it shall be." Clarice felt a sudden heat in her chest, followed by unbearable pain. It was as if every part of her being was being torn apart and reassembled at the same time. She opened her eyes and saw her body beginning to glow, her hands dissolving into fragments of light and shadow. The portal in front of her began to close slowly, but not before revealing something she would never forget. On the other side, inside the pharmacy, she saw a version of herself, pale, with empty eyes and robotic movements, serving grotesque customers like a lifeless puppet. "What is that?" Clarice managed to ask, her voice trembling with sobs of pain. "The echo of your humanity," the figure replied. "You sacrificed who you were to save the threshold. Now, you are part of it." The portal slammed shut with a deafening noise, and darkness consumed her. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the pharmacy, nor in the vast stone space. She was in an endless corridor, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. Shelves lined both sides, filled with bottles and boxes of medicines bearing unreal names. Clarice tried to breathe but realized she didn't need to. Her body was no longer human. Her hands were made of shifting shadows, translucent and unsteady. When she tried to speak, her voice sounded like a distant echo, almost unrecognizable. She was now part of the threshold, an eternal guardian destined to preserve the balance between worlds. The rules, once written in the book, were now etched in her mind, a painful reminder of her decision. As she walked through the endless corridor, she heard the chime of the entrance bell. A hazy figure stood at the counter, holding a prescription. Clarice moved forward automatically, as though guided by forces beyond her will. The customer handed over the prescription, and when she read it, a chill ran through her shadowed form. Clarice A. Silva, Essentia Vitali. Single dose. She looked up, but the figure had already vanished, dissolving into nothingness. Only then did she fully grasp the weight of her choice. Even as a guardian, she was not safe. The threshold didn't forgive, it only consumed. The corridor stretched out further before her, like an endless maze. And Clarice understood that the terror she had felt was just the beginning of an eternity filled with uncertainty.